Good morning to everybody and welcome to the plenary session of this morning. Before we start our session, I please invite you to revise the normal information which is up there, which is an update on logistic and so on. But please, your attention for a second, because we have a problem. And the problem should appear over there. Here is it. Unless you go to the desk and get a fixed IP address, it is likely that you're not able to connect via wireless. And this is caused because it seems that there is one machine, probably with a virus on board or something else, which is trying to attack the DHCP servers, making a denial of service-like problem. And they're not able to find it yet, which machine it is. So, first of all, please check what you have on board. If you have an antivirus or something like that, run it. And check the configuration that you have done to your machine, possibly. So please go to the desk and do not try to use the DHCP automatic configuration. It's likely you're going to duplicate somebody else's address if you do. Or don't invent your IP address, guessing it from somebody else. You're going to duplicate it as well. So, as soon as everybody has read it and is seated, I will start a normal session. But the help desk has asked me, please convey the information to anybody which is around. Okay, and meanwhile that you try to check your machine and what's the problem on board of it, I would like to introduce this morning plenary session. This morning plenary session is about two different topics. The first one will be how the next generation network backbone in Europe is going to look like. And Dai Davies is going to present us how differently it's going to look like from the previous one. It's a longer set of generation of backbones that we had since a number of years, and this is going to be really a different one. Both has a physical procurement and services which are going to run on it. And then we go to another topic, which will be introduced by Bob Coles, which is going to be about, very much in theme with what you're looking at the screen on it, security and what you can expect on daily life. But let's start from Dai first. Dai Davies is quite well known to many of us since a long number of years. I think I met Dai the first time when we were in Cosine, so it is 15 years ago, something like that. He has been manager of British Telecom, then he moved to Cosine Project Management, then he moved to Dante as soon as Dante was opened, and now he's a general manager of Dante. So let's pass the desk to Dai, and his presentation should appear. Here is it. Yes, up to you, Dai.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I'd like to cover this morning in this plenary session is the next generation of pan-European research network. Obviously, RARE and the Terena are very much focused on research networking in Europe and really have been one of the sort of backbones behind the creation of backbones, as it were. And over the last 12, 15 years, we've seen a number of generations of European research network. I have to. Well, I can use both a fixed and a roving microphone now. Anyway, as I was saying, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've built a number of generations of European research network, and each one of them has been a bigger, faster version of the previous network. If I go back to when I came into this world, there was a lot of argument about technology, and that probably hasn't changed. But in practice, we've been building IP networks for the last 15 years. And the current Géant network, which when it was introduced in 2001 was the major breakthrough, is what I'm showing at the minute. It's characterized by being essentially based on 10 gigabit links, but it's a pure IP network. And that has served us well for the last 3 years. Now, one of the things you would say is, why don't you simply continue with what you've been doing in the past and continue to build bigger, faster networks? And there are, in fact, a number of reasons why this simple strategy, which has worked so well, is one that really doesn't seem to apply anymore. And they're partly related to the usage that people are choosing to make of these networks, they're partly related to the economics, and they're partly also related to the technology. And the main sort of challenge I see today is the challenge between rooted and switched networks. Historically, we've built rooted networks. Now we're looking very seriously at building a switched network. The versus which I've put between rooted and switched is in fact a little bit unfair, because I think what we will try and achieve is to get the best of both rooted and switched networks. There is no divide, as it were, which used to be the case between X25 and IP when this community went to war with one another. I think there really shouldn't be a war between rooted and switched people, but that's something we will learn in the next 2 or 3 years as we try and implement this sort of network. But that's the challenge. The challenge is to move from building bigger, faster IP networks to building a network which is quite different in terms of its characteristics and in terms of its behavior. And this difference between rooted and switched networks is something that I think will be a technical challenge in the next several years. One of the interesting things is if you look at the basic building blocks of networks, then one of the key building blocks is essentially the point-to-point connectivity which you create the network from. And what I'm plotting here on a linear scale is the structure of these building blocks going back to the first generation of network. And you can see that we're building all the time bigger, faster networks, and really spectacularly so in terms of the current generation of GEO, where we moved from essentially a building block of 155 megabits a second to a building block of 10 gigabits a second. And that was a very dramatic breakthrough. And we were then working along a curve which said basically technology, transmission technology was becoming all the time faster. This particular graph shows elements also of the deregulation in the European marketplace. So one of the things that Europe suffered from until the mid-1990s was a lack of access to transmission technology. And so some of this is due to deregulation, but most of it is in fact due to technology. If I show it on a logarithmic scale, you can see a slightly different picture. And what's important here is to note that the building blocks have ceased to increase in speed compared with the traditional trend. So one was looking at a sort of transmission equivalent of Moore's law, where the speed of transmission would essentially double every 2 or 3 years. And in fact, this has ceased to happen. Now, the basic building block is 10 gigabits. 4 years ago, the basic building block was 10 gigabits. And there are a number of reasons why we haven't gone to 40 or to 80 gigabits as was in fact predicted. So one reason for building a different type of network is in fact that the elements that you can use to create the network are in fact more limited than would had historically been predicted, that this normal development of transmission technology is something that has stopped. And it stopped perhaps for a couple of reasons. It stopped partly for reasons of cost, but also because of the overinvestment in the dot-com bubble. People actually discovered that they didn't need perhaps the same sort of capacity as they were looking at. So one very practical point is that it's not easy to build a 40 gigabit IP network to replace the 10 gigabit IP network, simply because the transmission is not available. So that's one technical issue which I think is quite significant. The other point which is important is to look at the difference in usage that people are making of networks today. And this is a graph of actual transmission on one of the Géant links. And you can see that somebody's putting between 4 and 5 gigabits just as a single flow on one point-to-point link on the Géant network. Now, 4 or 5 years ago, this would have been unheard of. What you saw was aggregate traffic. You saw the traffic of thousands of researchers in the UK communicating with thousands of researchers in Germany, and you couldn't pick out individual flows. Now you can see an individual flow of around about 4 gigabits a second, which is about the equivalent, which is about loading one complete trunk circuit. So you can see that individual usage at the sort of capacity which is used to build the network is starting to become a practical feature of research networking in Europe. No longer are we dealing with aggregate flows, we're also have to deal with individual flows that are very significant in terms of the sort of traffic capacity that they're capable of generating. And this very large point-to-point flow is something that you can see as a characteristic, particularly of e-science, but it also reflects the ability of computers and machines to generate flows that are significant in relation to the dimension of the network which is carrying them. So you've got, as well as the fact that the building blocks are being constrained, you've also got the fact that performance, demands for performance from a user's point of view are becoming increasingly significant. And very large point-to-point flows is something that the next generation of network has to be able to cope with. And I think that's a very significant design factor, which is one of the reasons why Géant 2 is a different sort of network from the Géant network. The other thing which is important is the actual cost of providing the routing or switching capacity. And what I'm plotting here is the difference in the cost between interfacing routers and switches. Now, the purple line is the cost of router interfaces, the white is the cost of switch interfaces. And you can see that there is a very significant difference between the cost of interfacing things to switches when compared with the cost of interfacing them to routers. And there are several reasons for this. Well, one reason, which is quite a fair reason, is the fact that a switch is a much simpler device. It doesn't have expensive per-packet processing. It doesn't have the same sort of level of complexity as does a router. So from that point of view, it is a simpler thing to build. I suppose it's also the case that there are rather more manufacturers of switches than there are of routers. And so in practice, the sort of duopoly which exists in the router world is not quite a duopoly, but I think in practice that might reasonably be seen to be the case. Makes routers more expensive anyway. So you have got basically a more effective market in the area of switches and a simpler device. So these two things imply that one should be looking at, where possible, using a switch network as opposed to a routed network. And if you have large point-to-point flows, then the logic of supporting them with switches as opposed to routers is something that is obviously very, very strong indeed. Interesting about Géant 2 when compared with Géant is the fact that we are actually, for a very large number of routes, lighting our own transmission as opposed to leasing wavelengths. Now, dark fiber is something that the dark is a characteristic which is, in terms of sort of certainly general UK experience, something that is mysterious. It's sort of unusual and different. But in practice, the case for lighting dark fiber is a very strong economic case, and you can see it on this graph. What I have with this blue line is the sort of typical price that for a lease circuit, and you can see that as you increase the number of leased circuits that you're leasing, you don't get much economic benefit. Underneath, what you can actually see plotted, and it's plotted for different manufacturers, albeit encoded in terms of their names, you can see the actual underlying economics of implementing wavelengths over dark fiber. And you can see a very clear case to be made in terms of using dark fiber as opposed to leasing wavelengths. It's purely an economic benefit, but it is quite a striking economic benefit. This is the underlying cost base if you light dark fiber, and this is typically what telecoms operators will expect you to pay if you lease multiple wavelengths. There's nothing magic about dark fiber, but it's quite a money-saving device. So you have a number of different elements of technology and the different elements of economics. And of course, the important point here is that you're looking at implementing multiple wavelengths in order to make this economic case happen. And that implies multiple 10 gigabit wavelengths as opposed to, say, a single 40 gigabit wavelength. The economics are driven by multiplicity in terms of the justification for investing in dark fiber. And all of these things come together, the cost of technology, the changing user demand, to want to build a hybrid network. And that really is basically what Géant 2 is about. It's about building a different sort of network, not just a routed network, but a combination of routing and switching. That's fine, but I think you then got to look at some of the technical and implications of how you actually build this network. Does anybody in the audience know who this person is? No, it's not me. It's a latter-day geek, not Dai Davies. Maybe some of the Danes in the audience, I can see at least two, will have some awareness of who this guy is. No? Try him at a later stage in his life. No? Well, this is a man called Erlang. And Erlang is interesting in as much as he was the person that was responsible for the mathematical theory that shows how circuit switch networks work and behave. And the reason why I put his picture up, both in his youthful state and also in his more advanced and successful state, is that most of the theory which he developed in the context of building circuit switch networks is something that we really, as a community, need to be able to manage and understand. Because if we don't get this mathematics right, then we will find a very dissatisfied group of users who are unhappy and unwilling to use hybrid networks. Because whereas rooted networks degrade gracefully, they don't suddenly fail on you. You may get very unhappy with them, but they degrade gracefully. The difference between a rooted and a switched network is that switched networks either succeed or fail. And if they fail, then the user is extremely unhappy. There is no sort of happy path of degradation through to unhappiness. You're either happy with a switched network or you're unhappy with it. And Erlang was responsible for putting together the basic mathematical theory that underpins the way you build switched networks. I'm told that the only way to understand his work is to read it in the original Danish. I have to confess that I haven't actually done that. But no doubt people who understand Danish will be able to comment on whether that's the only way to really get into understanding what Erlang's about. But let's look at some of the analysis which he did, because this is really quite important in terms of building the next generation of network. And what you can see here is the relationship between the offered traffic, and this could say be switched gigabit Ethernet, and the capacity that you need to put into place in order to carry this traffic. And the other thing which you've got to remember with switched networks is that you have to work out what sort of level of failure you're prepared to accept in order to build the network. And here I'm showing relative failure rates of about, this is 1 in 10. The yellow line is 1 in 10. And then I go to 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000. And what you see, and you can translate that into an efficiency curve, is that if you're prepared to accept high levels of loss, in other words, you're prepared to accept the fact that 1 in 10 of your connections will fail, you will get quite an efficient network. But as you reduce the level of failure you're prepared to accept, you actually reduce the efficiency of the network. And this is quite an important point in terms of the dimensioning of it. And you can see here that this is what you're looking at in terms of 1 in 1,000 lost. Then you get you get a much less efficient network. You never get more than about 50% usage if your loss, the maximum loss you're prepared to accept is 1 in 1,000. But if you're prepared to accept a loss of 1 in 10, you can get up to 80 or 90%. And you might say, well, a loss of 1 in 10 isn't that significant in terms of overall performance, so I would be prepared to accept this sort of loss. But in practice, the loss is not on an end-to-end basis, because each of these individual links that you use is something that you have to reserve and you have to use for the duration of your connection. And so that you have to actually add together the losses in order to understand what a true picture of the performance of the network is. And if you accumulate the losses and you look at the number of links, then you start to get a somewhat different picture. And you can see that if you are tolerating a loss of 1 in 10 on a single link, then by the time you've concatenated a number of links, you're really up to sort of serious levels of loss, sort of 30-40% loss on a typical connection. And really, is that the sort of performance that people are going to be prepared to accept from a network? And the answer is no, they're not. So in practice, you have to look at the way you dimension the network much more closely in this context, because it's a succeed or fail network. It's not a degrade gracefully network. And this practical difference is one that if we, in terms of as a community designing and building networks, don't get to understand and utilize this approach, then we will end up here, because we will think, well, 1 in 10 is a decent loss, and we will find out that 40% of our connections fail. And 40% of the connections failing is a completely unacceptable level of network performance, even though the basic premise that 1 in 10 is an acceptable loss is not an unreasonable one. And you can see that packet switch networks, basically the packets got through somehow or another. They may have been delayed, they may have been lost occasionally, but you always got something through. But here you have an environment which is totally intolerant to failure. And if you don't want to have an intolerant network, then you have to dimension it correctly. Another way of looking at the accumulating losses is to sort of see that if you take this sort of level of service, which is 1 in 1,000, as being a reasonable dimensioning for a link, that's one block in 1,000 attempts, then you actually get some quite reasonable performance as you go to multiple links. But 1 in 10, you can see that you're losing half of your connections. So this is the important difference. It's not just the technology difference, it's the difference in terms of the way the network is built, the way the network is dimensioned, where you have to start thinking in a very, very different sort of way. And I go back to this efficiency curve, because this efficiency curve is about building the right sort of network, because it's a different type of network. And you can see here that if you want an efficient network, you want also a network that is not prone to failure, then you're accepting performance which really on quite large numbers of links is only reaching the 50 to 60%. And providing you recognize these dimensioning rules, providing that you build a network that's appropriate to them, then the next generation, this different type of network, will succeed. But the risk associated with building this type of network is that because it's incorrectly dimensioned, you will have high levels of failure, and people will write off the circuit switch element of the network, and we will go back to building bigger, faster packet networks, mainly because the mathematics is difficult, mainly because the dimensioning rules are much less sympathetic than the dimensioning rules are for packet switch networks. And if we don't recognize those factors, then we will lose. The other thing which I think is interesting is that you can see here that what this argues in favor of is much larger pools of circuits. Now, one of the things when you design a network topology in Europe, and I don't suppose it's very different in terms of the other parts of the world, is that network topology design is nothing to do with networking. It's much more to do with political science in reality. The practical point about building a network is satisfying the people that use it. And with a packet network, this is relatively easy to do, because you simply mesh the network and the performance is not such an issue. But with a circuit network, you can see very strong arguments in favor of having large pools of connectivity, because it's more efficient. And it will be interesting to see the way the topology of the next generation network in Europe develops over the next several years, between satisfying the performance requirements of users and satisfying the political requirements of users to have a nice big fat node in their country. And in reality, I think what I'm seeing is now we're building this hybrid network. We're building it for good technical reasons, we're building it for good economic reasons. The challenge is to make it work, and the challenge to make it work is understanding the dimensioning of these networks and to be able to dimension them correctly. Because if we don't do that right, in practice what will happen is there will be a very unhappy user base, and we will go back to building bigger, faster packet networks, because happiness of the user base is easier in a packet environment than in a circuit environment. Thank you.
Is there any question from the floor? I think Dai presented a very good mathematical and practical explanation why we are going differently this time. But I believe this is the first time for some of you which heard about it. So have one, of course, how much are you going to balance between the traditional routed one and the new switched one? Have you got already some plans on how to do it, or just a rough idea? Or?
Well, we're starting with the assumption that anybody who has a 10 gigabit IP connection should also have a 10 gigabit point-to-point connection. So essentially what we're saying is that from the beginning, the balance is 50% in terms of traditional routed capacity and 50% in terms of point-to-point capacity, which is essentially switched capacity. It is relatively easy to add switched capacity, relatively cheap to add switched capacity, because certainly for most of the routes where we're looking at dark fiber, you can see, and if I go back to the dark fiber picture, the marginal cost of adding the capacity is relatively low. Whereas if you had a leased environment, you had more or less a more or less linear relationship between capacity and cost. You have the virtue that by lighting your own fiber, you have a much lower marginal cost of adding wavelengths. So it's possible to add the capacity. The challenge is going to be to add it in the right places and to have it there before you need it, as opposed to having it there when you have a high level of network failure. And this requires much greater discipline in terms of network design. So the simple answer is, basically for most locations, half of the network capacity will be point-to-point. Then the question how it will develop is, cost-wise, it is relatively easy to add additional point-to-point capacity. But the planning process, and not just on the backbone, but also on the national networks, is such that that is a big challenge which we've all got to get right.
Any other from the audience? Okay, if not, then we thank again Dave for the presentation. And I switch on again for those who came in later on my little announcement. Meanwhile, they change the slides. So if you haven't read it now. And this announcement is also, I think, a nice introduction of what Bob Coles is going to present to us. The presentation of Bob is going to be related to the risks that you can expect whenever you plug in your computer to a network. So what can happen, what you can encounter in daily life. Bob is from Stanford Linear Accelerator Laboratory in California, and he is also there taking the responsibility for user security advisors. So it is his main role just to find out and warn people and identify in advance what are the risks. So I let the floor to Bob and to his presentation. Please, Bob.
I was pleased that, can you hear me? Okay. All right, raise your hand if you can't hear me. You cannot hear me. Okay, all right, good. So it's just the people in the back that can't hear me. All right. I was really pleased with the artistic show at the National Museum last night, because I don't know if you noticed it or not, but the theme was really about, the major theme that was there was about computer security. I mean, did you notice the two guys that were sort of like hacking at each other? I mean, those were the attackers trying to battle out who had control of your machine. Okay, it's not you. It's someone else. And at the end, they had the bots, with the little lights on the forehead and everything. That was a perfect representation of the fact that your computers are owned by someone else, and they are part of a collection that are being used for collecting financial information, for sending spam, for sending phishing emails, for doing distributed denial of service. You don't own your machines. Someone else does. The market price for these machines is about 10 cents each or less. And that's what's going on now. People are collecting these machines and selling them. About a year ago, I gave a presentation at another conference where I said this was my final slide. This was the end of the points I was trying to make. That the attacks are coming faster and the attackers are getting smarter. They're starting to use complex attacks using multiple vulnerabilities to get at what they want. There is no simple solution. There are various things that help, but no magical, easy thing that you can do. Things like using encrypted passwords and tunnels do help if you use them. You can't be secure. You can only be more secure. Security is sort of a process. And we have to learn how to share information better. We have to understand what is really going on so that we are really aware of the risks that are involved in connecting to the internet. Okay? At this same conference that I was giving the talk, actually that I was giving it this year, because this is an extension of that talk that I gave, I was sitting there the day before with my wireless turned on, running a sniffer. These were professional. These are like, the top system administrators at a bunch of the research labs around the world. These are the passwords I collected off of the wireless. One of them was from a vendor. Notice the last password. There are two where it was actually so obvious that I was afraid that if I actually put the real password up there, that it would be clear whose password it was. Now, the great thing about that one is that this person tried to log in using one password and it told him, no, that's not right, so he used a different password. So now I know two of the passwords that he normally uses. Okay? Great strategy. Say, no, that's not the right password, and so people will try all of the passwords that they normally use. They're secure ones, they're insecure ones, all of them, to try to log in. It's wonderful. These are people who should know better. There's one guy who came up to me after my talk and said, oh my God, I didn't know that password was going in clear. I thought it was encrypted. He said, thank you so much. I had no idea. The thing is that we are now faced with new technologies, a lot of protocols that send clear text information. When we were using these wired networks, there was starting to be some consciousness that, you shouldn't send information in clear text over the network. And when we went to, as things started going to more switch networks, people relaxed, I think. They think, it's a switch network, I don't have to worry about it. Well, first of all, that's not true, because it's real easy to turn a switch into a bridge. It's real easy. Everybody knows how to do it, who wants to know how to do it. The other thing is, of course, there's this ubiquitous wireless protocols now. And guess what? Everybody can see everything that's flying around. HTTP, it's sometimes difficult to tell if that's encrypted or not because of the little frames. For instance, if you go to the American Express website, it asks you to log in. And if you look at the web page, it's not HTTPS, it's HTTP. However, there's a little frame there where you enter your user ID and password that they claim is HTTPS, but only that frame. The surrounding page is not encrypted. So, that makes it very difficult to tell. And I think this is a very bad policy on the part of institutions like Bank of America, which does the same thing. American Express. They train users to enter their user ID and password into web pages that do not appear to be encrypted. Those of you that are using Linux, using SMTP to send out your email, guess what? It's all going in clear text. I can read all of it. Do you want me to read all of it? Maybe some is okay, you don't care. Maybe some you do care. POP, visible email. I can see the email as it goes by. And for at least some of you, unless you take care to use a version of POP that encrypts the passwords are in clear text. Same with IMAP. FTP and Telnet have visible sessions. The files that go across are all visible, can all be reconstructed. Network file systems, when you access those, NFS, AFS, all of those blocks of data that come across are in clear text. The other thing to be concerned about here are fake service providers. You know, you open up your laptop, you see an access point that says Torino, you say, oh, I trust that. How do you know that's really Torino? When you get a DHCP address, how do you know that is the official DHCP server? DHCP is a wonderful way to play man in the middle. I get to provide you with an IP address. I get to provide you with me as being the gateway, and I get to control your, where you go for any DNS resolution. Wow, that's almost as good as owning your machine if I get to see everything in the middle. If I want to collect information from you, I can just set up a website, ask you to register. What are you going to register with? You're going to pick a standard username that you use, and how many passwords can you stand to remember? Well, you're going to use one of your standard passwords, aren't you? So if I just ask you to register at a website, I'm going to start collecting information about you. And oh, guess what? I'll say, oh, by the way, in case you forget your password, would you answer, these questions? What's your mother's maiden name? What's your favorite color? And give me the name of your pet. So that way, even if you use a different password at my website, I'll know what all of the I forgot my password answers are at some other website, where maybe you have a higher quality password. Silence. There aren't cheers here about. You're thinking about all the places that you're not sure where you put in your user ID and password. Huh? There are lots of insecure protocols that are used when you're accessing the internet. For instance, instant messaging, AIM, Yahoo Messenger, ICQ, Jabber, all those send messages in clear text. All of your conversations with your friends and your significant others that are going over instant messaging are all in clear text. As you send them over the wireless network, they're all visible. When you go to a kiosk, when you go to an internet cafe, when you use any public access machine, you should all know, I hope you all know as professionals, that physical access is the key. If I have physical access to a machine, I own it. It doesn't matter what security is in place within the operating system. If I have physical access to a machine, I own it. Therefore, any machine that you use in a public facility has to presume to be compromised. You have to presume that it has a keystroke logger on it, and it has captured every one of the passwords that you enter into it. Whether or not the people that run that facility know it or not. We're vulnerable to worms on the local network. Some of the, I'm sure that some of you run firewalls, things like either the Windows, say the Windows XP firewall, or some of the other free versions that are available. Guess what? Those firewalls still have a tendency to treat the local network as special. See, they know that, you know, if you're going to install this firewall at home, you don't want to have to go through a lot of configuration just to make sure that your other machines at home can all talk to each other. So that by default, so they'll have a tendency to say, by default, allow other machines that are on your local network not to be inhibited by the actions of the firewall. Well, guess what? When you connect up to a wireless network at the local, you know, Wi-Fi hotspot, everybody else that's connected to that wireless network is on your local network, except now they're not people at home, they're anybody around. Oh, by the way, that wireless network you installed at home, what about that one? What kind of protection do you have on that? It's not just at home, it's all of your neighbors too. It's maybe somebody driving by on the street or parked in front of your house or in your neighbor's backyard. Those are all part of your local network now too. So you need to think about how well you know these people and how well you trust them with all of your financial information. By the way, one of the worms that hit really hard in the a couple of years ago, in August 2003, was the RPC DCOM worm that spread across the internet very quickly. That was discovered by a local Polish research group, and in fact, there is that sort of specializes in Windows vulnerabilities. There's in fact another one that specializes in more in Linux. At least they've been fairly successful in coming up with a vulnerability that was known as DO_BRK. It was a nice little vulnerability that allowed any user who was logged into a Linux box to easily get root on the box. Oh, this is great. Passwords for coffee. You would think in a place like San Jose, California, very close to Silicon Valley, people would be more aware of these kinds of implications. The San Jose Mercury News did a promotion standing outside of a Starbucks giving out $3 Starbucks coupons. Now, you can't get much at Starbucks for $3, but they were giving out $3 Starbucks coupons in exchange for passwords. You know, something like 70% of the people would give up their passwords or give up what they claim to be their password for a $3 Starbucks coupon. One guy couldn't remember his password. He went to his office and sent his administrative aide back to get his coupon for the $3 off on the coffee. And she was so excited about it that she gave up her password so that she could get one too. Now, you know, about a year ago, they also did the same sort of study in the UK with about the same result. This is really scary. I mean, people really do not understand the implications of giving out their password. This is your identity online. This is the key to your financial information, your credit card information, you know, everything that's kind of like known about you. And if you think this isn't serious, you ought to check out this last URL where attackers are really going after, not after individual machines. See, there are two things that are going on. What we did was by going to kind of switch networks and by sending incredible amounts of data through the internet. that we sort of like hid a lot of the information that's going across the network, but we hid it in plain sight because we just covered it up with a flood of other stuff. So most people, except near the endpoints, like on a wireless network or something like that, don't have to really worry about the HTTP versus HTTPS thing, because the data flowing through the network is in the middle of this incredible flood, and the fact that someone could pick off your information at the middle of the network is really unlikely. So what they're doing is they're going after the endpoints. They're going after the individual machines to take those over, and they're going after the servers. This list of recent compromises discusses what are the servers that have been hit. Now, one of the strategies that is currently being used is there's a group of attackers in Indonesia that are quite good at going after databases. They'll go after corporate unprotected databases, particularly where people have foolishly left the back-end database that contains all of your customer information, including their credit cards and stuff like this, on the same server as the web server. Oh, is that ever a configuration mistake? The web server gets compromised. They have immediate access to the database server. They compromise that, make sure they have a backdoor installed so that not only do they capture all of the existing transactions, they can come back each day and harvest the new ones. This is actively going on right now, and it has been for some time. But this last URL here gives a pointer to some really big ones that have at least been publicized. We're talking about the potential, at least, for millions and millions of identities to be stolen. Over the last few years, the research community and the university educational community has been dealing with a set of attackers that come in through SSH. SSH was supposed to save us, right? It has, it's secure, it has, encrypted connections, and it's been, of course, a big source of security compromises. So what was happening was an attacker was installing a Trojan. They would get root. They would say, like, they would be able to log into a machine, get root somehow because it wasn't fully patched, say by this do_brk vulnerability. Install a Trojan version of SSH that had a keyboard logger in it that would capture all the passwords and send those off somewhere. Using this tactic, the attackers were able to move through a number of the research labs and research universities. For instance, I know that Caltech was almost shut down for a week while they cleaned out SSH. This is the same group that created what was formerly known as the TerraGrid incident. They came up with some tactics later on, and they kept modifying them. We had one machine at the Linear Accelerator Center that was compromised through this path. The machine they happened to compromise, though, was our AFS server, so that we noticed it fairly quickly when AFS stopped working. And that was, in some sense, very lucky for us, because it could have happened that we didn't know that it had been compromised. They came back later with some other tactics where, when they couldn't compromise a machine and actually get root, they would install a user-level process that would just scan the internet looking for open X sessions, places where people had specified xhost plus, because what? That's easier, right? It's easier to say xhost plus, that way you don't have to specify who's going to connect back to you. Well, if you specify xhost plus, then you have what is known as an open X session. That means anyone on the internet can connect to you, and guess what? They can capture all of your keystrokes. All of them. Every single one. Including whenever you type a password. So that's what this was set up to do. It would look for OpenX sessions. Guess what software is most likely to, by default, have Xhost Plus? Windows versions of X, of X. So a lot of the commercial packages that Windows users install by default will set up Xhost Plus. So they ended up with a bunch of Windows boxes that they knew the passwords to. Well, what do you do under those circumstances? Well, what's the best rootkit around for Windows? Hacker Defender. Hacker Defender is really scary if you've ever had contact with it. It hides processes, it hides registry entries, it hides files. It is very difficult to uncover, and it comes with a a package that can be used to obfuscate it so that it can get past antivirus packages. The other thing, one of the standard techniques that was being thought about being used against these attackers was to go to some sort of two-factor authentication, or to go to something that didn't use reusable passwords, either the RSA tokens or something like that. However, some places that did already have that discovered that these same attackers had developed a different technique too, and that is they would get on a machine, root it, and then look at the active sessions that were going through, hijack an active session. They actually had the tools where they hijack an active session and use it to log into a different machine and then compromise the new machine. So that it didn't matter that they didn't know your password or they couldn't guess your password. If they could get on the machine at all through some other means, they had you. So they had a way around these tokens. Those tokens are pretty expensive to implement. We were thinking of okay, rolling that out, it's probably $500,000, maybe even $1 million, and then several $100,000 per year just to maintain that kind of solution. But if we do that, what are they going to do? They're going to go to session hijacking instead of passwords. So what have we accomplished? Almost nothing, and yet at a very great expense. So here's a couple of references that are up there on the on that tactics. We've seen a great decrease recently in those SSH compromises. There are another series of SSH attacks that are going on right now, though, and that is a continual set of scans. I don't know if you folks are actually involved in looking at what's going on security-wise on your network, but it turns out that there are probably about 4 or 5 scans per day just coming in from random places across the internet, scanning all of your hosts that have port 22 for SSH open, looking for weak passwords. And the set of passwords that they're scanning for is growing ever more sophisticated and with a larger set. Initial scans like this were looking for passwords that were like blank or null or password or a password of root or something like that, Amazingly enough, we got a machine compromised by that. It was a student who was installing a machine, and it got to be about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and he had to go to class, and he wasn't sure what password he should set for root, so he set password. It was Friday afternoon, he went to class and left it that way all weekend. Well, it didn't make it into Saturday before it was compromised. So these things are, regardless of what policies that you set up, you can still get hurt by these things. Now, what's on the increase? What are the things that we're seeing increasing now? Phishing. I hope everybody knows by now what phishing is. We'll see a couple of examples of it. You probably every day you see several ads or several things where, oh my God, your eBay account is going to get shut down, or your account at some bank that you don't bank at is going to get closed if you don't go somewhere and take care of something, right? The 914 people have now converted to sort of phishing and are actually posting job ads. This is sort of a new technique. 914 is the Nigerian scam, or the gold in Afghanistan that has to be moved out, or somebody that has a lot of money somewhere that needs some help moving it, and they're willing to give you an incredible percentage of it if you'll just help them. Well, now, sort of like, they've got a job and they'll help you get this wonderful job, but of course, there are these fees that you need to pay in advance. And so now they've converted from money to job ads. Farming. This is one I don't know if you've heard of. This is where you attack DNS servers so that when you think you go to a legitimate website, you actually end up somewhere else because somebody has poisoned DNS. Now, you all know that DNS is a really highly secure system, right? Wrong. It is very insecure, and it's very easy to compromise, and therefore redirect all the requests to legitimate websites off to some other place that you don't even know. And it all looks okay. There's no way you can tell. Oh, you can tell because of the certificate. Because a little warning comes up in the certificate, right? And what do? You click OK to make it go away. Because it's too complicated to read all that stuff. Spyware. Lots of spyware. Primary vector of spyware are peer-to-peer programs. Kazaa, BitTorrent, all of those things, they've loaded up with spyware so that when you download software and install software from those sources, you're just going to be loaded up with lots of spyware. Where do you get that? You get that from your kids. If they use your computer at home, they're going to go out and get all this neat stuff. And in fact, you may even do it. Ever hear of a program called WeatherBug? It's supposed to give you lots of information about current weather in lots of different places. Guess what? You get a lot of spyware with that. Google hacking. Lots of information available through Google. More information than people know is available. So that's always pretty scary. So lots of interesting ways of getting information out. Things that happen to be in the same directory. If it's a file that's accessible to a web server, then it's probably, the information in the file is probably accessible to Google, even though it's not an HTML file. And people don't realize this. They'll leave spreadsheets or they'll leave all sorts of files sitting around in the same directories as their HTML files, thinking that, oh, well, the web server won't pick that up. That's wrong. So here's an example of phishing, and I'm sure that if those of you in the back, it's just a standard thing. It's the horrible, the HTML email is the bane of my existence. I wish it had never been invented, because all it does is about triple the size of any reasonable email, and allow you to hide all sorts of things. For instance, this blue link here, that says scgi.ebay.com, and verify it. It looks, wonderfully legitimate, right? Because it goes to eBay. So you're going to fix your eBay account because it's been used possibly for fraud. However, that link that looks like it points to eBay, if you look underneath that link, it really points somewhere else. It points to an IP address that you don't even want to know where that is. And of course, one other way that you can sort of suspect that this is strange is that this was sent to an email list. The OS Open Science Grid integration team, and not to an individual. So it might lead you to suspect that maybe there's something to be suspicious about this. Then, of course, here's the standard. This is not the latest version of my talk. This is not the version that I uploaded. This is actually several versions back. Okay. It's over here, yeah, but it's not. That's all right. That's all right. If you download the talk, what? That'll take too long. Okay. There was also, let me just talk about this. There's also this last weekend a phishing attack against Postbank in the Netherlands. It's one of the larger banks there, and it uses a user ID password scheme, but then there's also a challenge. So they send you a sheet of paper that has a bunch of codes on it, and they'll tell you which code off of that sheet of paper they want you to type back in. So what happens then is there's this phishing attack that appears to go to Postbank if you look at the URL that's displayed on the screen. If you look under that URL, then it goes somewhere else. But it goes through Google in Spain, then to msn.com, and then the third referral to somewhere else with a bunch of percent signs and everywhere else. And if you then decode that, where does it go to but a website in Russia? Okay, a .ru website. Now, then what happens at that website? At that website, there's a bunch of complicated HTML, and what they'll do is they'll bring up the web page for Postbank, right? And in front of that, they'll put a pop-up. And the pop-up is not from Postbank, it's from them. The pop-up asks for your account number, your password, the next 3 or 4 codes off of this sheet, just so that I know that it's really you. Okay? It's amazing. It's amazing. Luckily, there was a lot of publicity about this in the Netherlands over the weekend, and so hopefully not too many people got bought by it. But that just happened just this last weekend, June 4th. Okay, this is the standard 419 type of letter that you're used to getting. Hopefully by now, most of you recognize that anything that comes like this in all uppercase, you automatically delete, right? And anything, it says, "Dear Sir or Madam, permit me to inform you my desire of going into a business relationship with you." That's right. Yes, they picked you out of all the people on the internet as being somebody who is trustworthy. It never happens. It never happens. You may be trustworthy, but nobody is going to know that from just particularly if, when they say, please keep this confidential, and they send it to, like the full disclosure security mailing list or something like that. New technologies are an incredible source of vulnerabilities. All of these wonderful, attractive things. We've already talked about the wireless stuff. But then there's another kind of wireless called Bluetooth that people feel really confident about. They even have Bluetooth in Lexus automobiles. And for a while, there was some suspicion that due to a compromise in certain kinds of Bluetooth protocols, that it was possible for somebody to own your Lexus. And it's not you, okay? It turns out that Lexus claims they have a proprietary operating system that wasn't vulnerable to this particular set of attacks, but it did have a lot of people worried for a while. And there was some big discussion of it on cryptomicon.net, which of course is now gone, while the site seems to have an almost permanent notice right now saying that it's in the process of being rebuilt. But anyway, just in this last week or so, there's an article in newscientist.com about how to hack secure Bluetooth devices. See, it used to be the case that they thought that, okay, so long as you'd already established a connection between your Bluetooth devices, that people couldn't hack into them because it was a secure connection. It turns out they've discovered a way to basically you do a denial of service attack on one of the devices to get it to drop the connection between the two, and then they'll reconnect. And as they reconnect, you can monitor that protocol that they're using to exchange their keys and use that to break into to this, quote, secure connection between the Bluetooth devices. Lots of people think that Bluetooth is only good for a very short range, just a few meters, right? But there are these guns with sensitive antennas on them that can easily pick up Bluetooth over 100 meters and possibly even longer. So you need to think about that when you've got your convenient little Bluetooth headset talking to your Bluetooth-enabled phone. What does it allow these attackers to do? They can steal your contact list. Oh, by the way, they can make telephone calls through your phone without you knowing it. Exciting, huh? New technology is wonderful. RFID tags. Oh, wonderful things. They're going to put them on all the items in the store so that they know when you carry them out and haven't paid for them. And so, you can just walk up to the checkout stand and they can just, that it's even easier than the scanning that they do now with the barcodes. This just, they just kind of, you just kind of wave it and it automatically registers what the product is and how much it costs. Well, some industrious Germans have figured out that a lot of these RFID tags that people are deploying now, like putting on products in stores, are not read-only, they're read-write. So guess what? You can take an RFID tag that's on one product and put the product code in there for a much cheaper product. You think the clerk is going to notice? Nah. They don't pay the clerks enough to care about that kind of thing, right? So that's certainly a wonderful thing. There are lots of privacy concerns about what happens when you start wearing clothes that have embedded RFID tags in them, and sort of as you go past the scanners, all of the serial numbers and product codes off your clothes are then read, and so you can basically be traced that way, or you can certainly be have targeted ads aimed at you. Although sometimes I would really like to feel like an ad was targeted at me. Like how many times do I have to receive an ad for an enhancement of a body part that I don't have? Or, something like that. Or for a home mortgage right after I've refinanced. Things like that. Voice over IP, becoming very popular, wonderful new technology. There are already services available. You know, caller ID, right? You can depend on, caller ID as to who somebody is. Right? Wrong. Anybody with a PBX can fake any caller ID that they want. There are services available that allow you to call them up, tell them what caller ID you want to appear as, and then route the call through them to whoever you want to call, saying, "Hi, honey, I'm still at work." You have to hide the background noise of the, of the bar that you're in currently, but but it would show the caller ID coming from wherever it was that you wanted it to be. So, if you have to be careful about any information that you think about that, about things like caller ID. Voice over IP, of course, gives lots of more opportunity for things like that. There will be lots of new things. The U.S. has just passed a law requiring that voice over IP vendors have to be able to provide location. I'm really wondering how they're going to do that, because, for instance, whenever I use voice over IP, I also use it through a VPN tunnel. So by the time my voice over IP connection hits the internet, it looks like I'm coming from Menlo Park, California, regardless of where I'm actually located in the world. So it's not clear to me how that's going to work. FireWire is a wonderful new technology, fairly new. Turns out that a FireWire device is able to write into the memory of the computer without any security. Well, how long do you think it's going to be before somebody's going to come up with a program to put on your iPod such that when you go in and connect it through a FireWire connection to any device that's FireWire enabled, and then you own it? Probably, within a year. Within a year. So you can be owned by an iPod. Just connecting an iPod to your machine means that you'll be compromised. Collaborative environments are sort of coming into the fore. This is sort of a whole different area, but what's happening is we're seeing, we used to have all the users for these organizations that we would have relationships. We would say, okay, all your users have to register with us. We have to know who they are. We're getting away from that. What we're seeing is we'll make an agreement with an organization. The organization will say, we'll take care of the users. We'll take care of the user IDs and passwords. We know who our users are. All you have to do is trust us and take our word for it. This includes lots of research organizations, things like grid computing. So we have to just trust this authorization assertion from this organization that identifies valid users. This has many security implications, things like incident response. How do you trace things back when you get an incident? How do you recognize credential theft? What does that mean now? Audit information, is that actually collected? Is it usable? Is it consistent enough that you can actually put together the audit records from all the different servers across, say, a grid environment and figure out what happened? How do you maintain the ownership of persistent resources? When somebody leaves a collaboration, what do you do with the things like the storage that is associated with them? So there are all sorts of unsolved problems here, and some interesting areas to deal with that I've been dealing with for a few years now. And I think it's nice because it's going to keep me busy and it's going to keep my my frequent flyer miles up for some amount of time. The UN just recently put out a thing on fighting cybercrime, and they said that what we need to do is create a culture of cybersecurity. We have to get people to think about how to prevent and actually to prosecute cybercrime. Developing countries are a really big issue in this area because the attackers particularly pick on them. Where the internet is growing fast in developing countries, those are where you're going to see the attacks coming from. That doesn't mean that people in those countries are bad. That means that the people in those countries don't understand at all about how to protect their machines. Not only that, there may be language barriers involved such that even if their machine is compromised, you know their machine is compromised, you can't tell them that their machine is compromised. When it's somebody in Korea or somebody in Brazil and you don't know Portuguese, or somebody, in Romania, to name a few countries that have experienced this a lot recently. And we need coordinated efforts to facilitate practical research into the real problems that are involved. We need global approaches to avert and mitigate impact on things like the critical infrastructure as we bring more and more of our critical infrastructure online and make it available to attackers. To have some sort of sustainable development in terms of how we keep going, how we protect privacy, and how we, of course, make sure that e-commerce, banking, and trade is promoted rather than being held back because of fears of cybercrime. So there's a URL to a web article on that. Some late-breaking news. Let me go back to my... There's some later late-breaking news. Let's see, there were numerous versions of a virus called MyTOB. In fact, in the last 3 months, there have been 125 versions of this that have all required a new signature update from your antivirus vendors. This particular virus turns off antivirus, and it opens up a back door for a root compromise. This is very typical of the standard virus that infects your machines these days. That opens up a back door to let somebody else in to perform further activity, and it turns off your antivirus. So it doesn't perform checks and it doesn't get any new updates. So you're going to be sitting there saying, I've got antivirus and it's installed. It didn't warn me about this. Everything must be okay. Meanwhile, somebody else owns your machine. On the 31st of May, Apple warned that Apple QuickTime allows information theft. Now, that sounds pretty scary. And in fact, I was really concerned about it. It took me as a security professional about an hour to figure out what was really going on. First of all, they can put a wrapper around a QuickTime movie and invisibly go get information off of your computer and send that back to a website anywhere on the internet. Now, what information can they get? Well, it turns out they can get things like the operating system you're running, the make of the computer, the name of the computer, and some facts about the hardware. And some information about certain kinds of images that you have stored on your machine, which could give them some clue about what kinds of applications are installed and things like that. So it's basically a way that they can profile you, but it doesn't appear that it provides access to, for instance, direct access to, for instance, your financial information. So it's not quite as scary as it could be. It also turns out that it only affects the Mac version of QuickTime and not the Windows version of QuickTime. My God, isn't that amazing? Something that doesn't affect Windows. This is an example of, that I think of something where we make things actually difficult for people to form an evaluation, to make a risk assessment. Because if you go to Apple's website and read the description of this vulnerability, there is no mention of the fact that it doesn't affect Windows. Well, of course, for them, Windows doesn't exist, maybe, but they still do produce a Windows version of QuickTime. All they say is that it provides access to information, but without really saying that, well, it is kind of limited. Now, maybe they have discovered that it's actually worse than the security researcher who reported it. The vulnerability may be actually worse than that. It may allow much more access, and maybe that's why they're not saying that. I don't know. But certainly if you have a Macintosh, and I see a few of you do, I hope you have updated or recently updated your version of QuickTime to 7.0.1. Because otherwise, somebody could be, anytime you watch a QuickTime movie, you could be sending information out. I see these little apples lit up around the audience. I don't know if that means you're currently downloading the new version of QuickTime or not. On June 1st, there was what appears to be a coordinated attack of malware. We saw 8 variants of one called Glider that opens a back door, combined with a Trojan called Fantibag that disables antivirus and Windows Update. This is really insidious. So you got one thing that opens up a back door, something else that turns off antivirus, and any automatic updates for Microsoft for security issues. So that's really nasty. Also, there's another one called Midglider. Big Glider, it's supposed to be Glider. Well, I have so many typos, I can't believe it. I hope I fixed it. I think I fixed a number of these in the version that's up. The version that you see, if you've downloaded it, is it this version or is it different? No, it's different. Okay, good. It's what? Okay. Okay, all right. And then just yesterday, there's a new variant of the Spybot worm that spreads through network shares or unpatched systems. It tests about 4 different vulnerabilities in Windows that it looks for to spread. And it, of course, opens back doors for further compromise. This is the typical thing that we're seeing now, is that we are not seeing widespread attacks. The virus writers are limiting their attacks because they want to stay under the radar of the antivirus companies. The viruses almost all contain keyloggers now and backdoors so that they can collect information and passwords, and so that they can own your machine to use it as a spam bot, to use it for distributed denial of service, to use it for phishing, all sorts of things like that. They sell these things for anywhere from 5 cents to 10 cents a piece to spammers or whoever else wants to use them. Okay, it's become big business. This is new. This is like in the last 6 months, there's been this transition. This is a different kind of phenomena. Okay, so what are the final thoughts for now, for this year, 2005, June? Well, it's still the case, all operating systems are vulnerable. There isn't any wonderful one. All browsers are vulnerable. I mean, there was just, Firefox was going to save us from Internet Explorer, right? And there's been in the last, in the month of June, there were like 3 security updates to Firefox. With just this recent vulnerability here reported on May 9th. There is no simple solution. Security is complex, and it's still too complex. We don't seem to be able to explain it to people in simple terms. Well, for one thing, there's no simple solution, is there? But it's sort of like, well, it's kind of like safety. The fact you start taking risk as soon as you get out of bed in the morning. In fact, there are probably even risks to staying in bed. Well, the same thing happens when you connect up to the internet. There are risks that are associated with getting anything done. There are various things that you can do to help. Patching helps, firewalls help, antivirus, attachment removal help. We've had great success for a number of years at Slack by, there are 40 or 50 different file types that Microsoft say these are executable if you double click on them. Any one of those gets removed if it's in an attachment or if it's in a zip file. And that has certainly saved us from any large number of virus outbreaks, particularly since even though we're on the West Coast and you all in Europe get infected 9 hours before we do, it's often late afternoon before we get a patch from the antivirus people saying, oh, here, we found this. We say, thank you very much. What happened to all the email that we got in the morning from Europe and from the East Coast of the United States? Again, you can't be secure. That's just sort of like being anonymous, or privacy. You can't get there. You can only be more secure. So you can do things. You can do things that are safer, but you can't be secure on the internet. And we need to share information more. And there's this great website here called the 100 Best Security Websites that you can go to for a ton of information. And I know you're all going to read all of those 100 websites. But, it's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that you have to do if you want to be serious about it. If you don't want to be serious about it, then you can get your bank accounts cleaned out. It's okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I think Bob gave us a very latest update information what's going on, which we should all be aware. We have time for one or two quick questions, but are there any?
There are several hands up.
I'm here.
Yeah, hello, Saverio.
Saverio Niccolini from NEC. I have just a quick question. I was last week in Washington at the VoIP security workshop, and all the security experts there were not able to tell me like a real attack that has been seen already for VoIP networks. Just wanted to ask you if you have already been seeing such an attack to VoIP networks.
To what kind of networks?
Voice over IP networks.
Oh, no attack specifically. In fact, what I was referring to was using voice over IP for other things. But as far as I know, there's been no attack yet.
I've been trying to classify all those type of attacks during the last months, but I was not really able to document a real attack on it, so wanted to know your opinion.
No, I think it hasn't gotten interesting enough.
Yeah.
It's sort of like Macintosh. There aren't enough of them yet.
Yeah, because there are a lot of possible attacks, but maybe they are not yet interesting for attackers because there is no value in attacking a VoIP networks nowadays.
That's right.
Thanks.
Any other? Down there.
Oh, there's Diego over here.
Okay. Diego and...
Yeah, just a short comment to add to your list of scary stories is that we have also suffering when you're talking about the collaborative environments. We have also experimented some kind of denial of service attacks to parts of these infrastructures. I mean, to the one which are providing the identity assertions. You can block them by requesting a lot of assertion of them. And right now we don't have any way of blocking this kind of attacks. Just
yes.
Another one to something else to the history.
I purposely didn't mention a lot of attacks that could be performed against the grid environment because It's too easy. And I might get drummed out of the next meeting that I have to go to.
One more over there.
The question is, do I have an online bank account? Yes, I have an online bank account. Yes, I pay bills electronically. I put in credit card numbers, and I do all that. However, you know, when I go to my Bank of America webpage and it says that it's HTTP, even though there's supposed to be a little frame over there that's HTTPS, I keep going and clicking on various things until I can finally get to a web page that's HTTPS. I also use a wireless network, but I make sure that I always have a VPN tunnel, which is encrypted, that's going through the wireless. So, you know, I do take care of some other things. And of course, I use a bank that says, oh, of course you have zero liability, should, you know, which is, and if you believe that, well, you know, there's a bridge that I have for sale. Yes, way in the back, there's a question.
Up there, yeah. Well, while you go up there, just a phishing example. 10 days ago, my bank started to warn out people there's going to be phishing about our accounts and so on. A pity that we in the security group knew it 5 days before and got already 10 messages like that before. So they're always late.
Yes.
Good morning, Kamil Zakun from the AWT.be. As you did mention earlier on your presentation, there are lots of protocols which are clear text. Lots of them, like for instance mail, SMTP, POP and so on, are also available on the secure way. So I have two questions right now. What is your thought concerning why service providers does not deploy the secure versions? And second one, do you think that government might help issuing laws in order to force service providers providing secure services? Thank you.
I think a lot of service providers really don't understand, or they're afraid that they'll scare users away. However, for instance, there are some service providers that do care. This is not necessarily a plug, but if you go to, you know, the new Gmail, Google Mail service, Google provides IMAP and POP access to your Google Mail account, but they will only provide secure POP and secure IMAP connections. They don't provide the insecure ones. I mean, when I put these passwords up here and I said one of them was a vendor password, you know, and I talked to him about it, and he kind of shrugged it off and said, you know, that's my just throwaway account, and it turns out that his service provider didn't have a way of connecting with secure POP or secure IMAP. And, you know, what we should be doing is demanding that. I mean, the service providers will provide it if there's a demand. But right now, everybody thinks the security is too complex and that it won't happen to me. I mean, human beings are really bad at risk assessment.
So what about the second question? In fact, I'm working for the Belgian government. And don't you think that ministers and so on must issue laws in order to, let's say, force new services to be deployed in a secure way?
That helps some, but I think it also can interfere because the way laws sometimes get written actually impedes new technology and new advances rather than... I would much rather see it work through normal market forces than to see laws passed. But that's my own personal bias, I think.
Thank you.
Just a last comment very quickly. For example, there is a very well-known public wireless provider in Europe, which does roaming for most of the others, which has implemented secure connection, but all its certificates around are expired. So everybody gets a warning, the certificate is expired, what do you want to do? And they click continue, and they go over unsecure connection. And we warn them already since 3 months, every week. They don't understand what we are telling them. So this is a typical example, so that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of advantages of using things like the certificates The problem is that try to explain to anyone about asymmetric encryption and public key cryptography, and about 5 seconds into the lecture, their eyes glaze over and they say, they've had enough. The problem is then they don't understand what the exposures are and what the risks are. They don't understand when you should pay attention and when it's okay to sort of ignore a warning, because they have no understanding at all of the technology that's used. And we haven't provided a secure enough environment so that the technology can be used by regular people. I mean, it's difficult enough even for the people in this room to use cryptography, let alone the average person.
Okay, so I think we have to thank Bob and Dai again for their wonderful talk this morning. Coffee break. And remember